Cool. All right. So thanks to everyone who is in. I see a few familiar people in here, a couple of our current and former students. Good to see
Sweet.
you guys. Zach, Rob, nice to see you guys. Why don't we get underway? Thank you all for joining us this evening. Hi, Zach. So we have a couple of people in the chat that I want you to be aware of. One of our guys, Ross, he'll be in and out. But the head of Pyramind Online, Mario Graham, he is in the chat. So if for some reason I miss something, Mario is there to help moderate. I'll be talking about the online school a little bit as we go here throughout the evening. So if you have questions about the online school, he can help with that. Hello, Mario says hello. So we'll get to that here in just a few minutes. And then I will do my best here as Sean is going through his track to stop and ask questions. Obviously, we want to kind of go with the flow and see what's going on so you guys can get as much information as possible here this evening. Yep, Mario said shoot him a DM if you have questions about the online school. Cool. So to set the table for tonight, I want to welcome you all. Again, my name is Hart Thorson. I'm the admissions director and program manager here at Pyramind. I help with curriculum. I help teach classes, bring in all the students into our ground campus in San Francisco, along with my colleague Mario, who's in the chat. He helps with all of our online students. This night is all about two things: hearing some really great music from a really great artist, a close friend of the family who's been through the system himself, and learning about the online school. So we have a start date coming up on November 8th. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth as we go. Just to let you all know, we are going to give away some prizes from our wonderful sponsors, McDSP Plugins. Do you use McDSP plugins? Have you used?
I have.
Yes.
Yeah.
They're great. They're
Oh, yeah.
wonderful. So they're giving away a few things. You guys have to be present to win. So we will choose at random here. So no matter how many nice things you say in the chat, that probably won't sway us, though we will be flattered. So thank you very much for that. No, but we will draw those at the end to a few lucky people. And yeah, so stick around until the end. So I guess with that out of the way, I want to introduce you to someone who he's kind of done it all here at Pyramind. He was a student.
Yep.
He's gone on to teach our Ableton classes in person,
Yep.
our DJ classes, right? And he has since moved down to Southern California, where he is teaching in the online school. So a lot of you guys are probably pretty familiar with him. We shout about him a lot. He is I guess we could say up and coming producer. He has gotten support from AC Slater, Mala, amongst others.
Yep.
He'll talk a little bit more about his history and what he's doing, but we wanted to invite him here tonight so you guys could get a sneak peek of really what some of his classes are like, and just how he is as a teacher, a mentor, and a producer. Ladies and gentlemen, I know I won't be able to hear this, but claps amongst yourselves for Shdws. Welcome, Shdws.
Hello. Hello. Thanks for having me. So yeah, I have a long history with Pyramind. I took the core program. I think it was 2012 when I started that. And it was a bit of a different setup from the program now, but I took the core program, which is basically all of the classes you could possibly take. And those were in-person classes. And it was ranging from everything from different DAWs like Logic, Ableton, Reason, Pro Tools, and theory classes, and piano and sound design. So pretty robust course, but it really helped to elevate my game. And so I did that, and then I kind of just lingered around and started interning and just helping out here in the studios, and then that turned into my first teaching opportunity, which was, I think I just started with DJ 101, which was a kind of like pioneer record box class, DJ class, and then started doing 110 as well, which at the time was with Tractor, and then I was just kind of around in the space and started doing Ableton as well. So it's been a while. I think I've been teaching with Pyramind for probably about 7 years. and there were moments where I was doing 4 or 5 classes a week, and it was very busy. And now being in LA, it's a little bit tougher, but I'm still teaching the Ableton online class, which has been really, really cool. It's been a great way to stay connected and stay in the loop with the Pyrra fam, which is always really important to me. So shall we get into the track?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Cool. So I release music pretty often. Shdws is one of my it is one of many projects I've had, and it is my latest project. And I work with a couple different labels, Nightbase being one of the main ones. They're kind of the label I launched the Shdws project with, and as well as Divided Souls, which is Wax Motif's record label, which has been awesome as well. I just had a release on Uprise Music, a track called Embers, which is actually this session here that I have open. So I'm going to do a quick breakdown. I want to pretty much just talk a little bit about workflow in the beginning, because I think workflow is really, really important in production, and everyone has a different workflow, so it's cool just to kind of get a view at each artist's workflow and what makes them tick while they're producing. So this is the session I have here. I will say that this is the only session of this song. I do, again, this might just be me, or everyone's a little bit different. I tend to do all of my writing, all of my arranging, all of my mixing, all of my mastering, everything in one session. That is not always the most common way to do things, but it works for me. For me, it's all about keeping the pace and the momentum while I'm working. And if I have too many things that kind of bog me down or derail me, or I gotta export stems, and it kind of sometimes it can throw a couple stones in my steps and break things up a little bit and slow me down. So we can kind of see it all here in this session, which is pretty cool. So I'll talk a little bit about getting started. If you guys do have questions, you can always throw them in the chat, and then we can kind of pick through those as we're going and answer them once I get through some of this. Cool?
Cool.
Let's go. All right. So one of the main things, actually, if you guys have worked in Ableton or you are curious about it or have jumped into it at all, there are 2 big kind of workflows you can start with in Ableton, one of which being session view, which you guys are seeing right here. And if I hit tab, the other one being arrangement view. I actually don't really use session view a whole lot. We use it in the class. It's always really good to know what options you have and know session view inside and out, and know arrangement view really well, just so you can kind of figure out what works best for you. Session view is great if you are if you come from more of a live background and you want to be able to just kind of hit record and jam and keep things playing and keep things looping and kind of just get ideas out and put together some rough ideas. Session view is great for that. You can kind of do the same workflow in arrangement view. You can set a short loop and get going, and that's exactly what I do. I basically start all of my tracks with probably an 8-bar loop, 16-bar loop, depending on what I'm actually starting the song with, whether it's melodies, chord progressions, a vocal that I received, or if I'm just going straight into drums and bass line and groove. I kind of just start it there, and then once I get happy with that, just start to build it out a little bit. So I guess we can actually play a snippet of the track first, and then I can start to tear into it a little bit. So I'll play maybe just from this break where the vocal starts, and then a little bit of the drop, and then we'll dig in. Sweet. Okay. So I don't want to play too long of it, or too much. It goes on for a while. But it's a little bit of a different vibe. It is more on the techie side, whereas my night bass stuff is definitely more in like kind of the bass house world. But I like to venture around a little bit. I also think a big part of production that keeps it interesting is experimenting and not opening up a session and making the same exact kind of sound every day. You know, it's good to, especially for a brand and keeping things kind of on brand and on lock. It's good to have like a common sound throughout all of your music, but it's also within that you have to experiment and try new things. At least that's what I think is important. Um, so that's just a little bit of a snippet, and now we can kind of tear through some of the individual elements and where it started and how it came to what it is right now. Um, I actually started this track with the vocal. Um, this vocal is a sample, and the vocalist had a couple different stems online, and I grabbed the ones I like. All the vocals you're hearing in this track are actually not from the same vocal. The main verse is, of course, the same vocal that I actually cut it up and rearranged it in a way that I felt kind of worked a little bit better, at least for how I was using it. But that really atmospheric vocal you're feeling in that the first 8 bars of the drop is a different sample. So it's a bit of a Frankenstein here, but I think they all kind of came together and worked well. So that vocal is down here in the vocal group. You can see these 2 main vocal tracks. The rest, all these other kind of versions of the track you are seeing here are atmospheric layers and transitional layers and just more kind of like effects-based fun stuff. So I will play that. I'll show you. I have a big synth that I wrote behind it, and then we'll go from there. I'll show you what it turned into. So.
I feel the night by my side. Put me in for a ride. A vision of you makes it okay.
Okay.
Take hold of.
So that's basically what I started with. And it's nice if you are going to work with a vocal, it's nice to start with that. It's a little tough sometimes if you have an instrumental and you take a vocal or a sample that's already written and you try to work it into your instrumental because they kind of need to be written to each other. So it was nice in this case to start with a vocal. Immediately from there, I went to a synth to kind of add some body and some power to it and give that vocal some support. And that is this big Serum filter sweeping bass. It actually feels pretty warm and analog for Serum, which is a little tough to get out of Serum. But it feels good, and it adds like some nice depth underneath the vocal. So that is this MIDI layer. Cool. So in the break, that's kind of it. There's the vocal. There's this kind of low bassy synth, and everything else is just kind of ornamental elements, kind of dancing around that. Cool little reverse reverbs and vocal hits, kind of just playing around in the atmosphere, which is very important, especially for a vocal. Kind of have that ear candy to fill up space and just add excitement and keep things interesting. So vocal. That Serum bass in the break. Other kind of secondary atmosphere elements like a high string. Just classic house, just kind of holding the root note. A little bit of a weird atmospheric texture in the background, building some tension. And then you can also, you guys may have heard it playing this bass. There's a little bit of automation on that. So there's a filter that's opening over time, which is really good for building tension. There's reverbs and delays that start to come in towards the end to make it a little bit more atmospheric, or with this echo here, actually. And this is a great serum or Ableton preset for the echo, one that I use a lot. So that's where this started. That whole section right there is 16 bars, and I just started to kind of get a feel for where I wanted the track to go from there, and I wanted it to transition pretty quickly. I didn't necessarily want to do any like big build-ups. I just kind of wanted to let the melodic elements kind of naturally tail out and tail out into what would start as more of like a chill drop that eventually kind of, you know, became more and more energetic and kind of dark over time. So that transition here is pretty cool. So those are all the elements that I started with. In that transition, when the drop hits, it's really, really simple. It is a kick drum. It is one single bass line, which is usually the way to do it, especially for low-end elements. You want to keep them as simple and clean and separate from other low-end sounds as possible to avoid any muddiness or any issues. So that's how the drop starts. What makes it really special is the transition. There's a lot of cool elements that kind of tail out and carry over into that. So you'll be able to hear it on this bass. So it kind of has this weird filtered atmospheric reverb and delay tail. I think that is also happening on a piece of the vocal that repeats.
A vision of you makes it okay.
So that last little bit where she says okay, there's some automation here on this delay, on the dry wet, our amount of delay. And that just comes up so that it's not an abrupt cut. It has this nice kind of dramatic tail to it. And all of that flows into the drop. Because if I just play, you know, without any of that, if I just play the first section where the kick and the bass hit, that's it, right? So it's cool. It has good power to it, but it feels a little too dry and a little bland. So those transitional tricks really make it kind of pop.
A vision of you makes it
okay. Okay, cool. So that's the transition. That's what really got the arrangement to start to come together. Sometimes it's a little tough to kind of figure out, you know, a progression or a melody or something for a breakdown or a more atmospheric part of the song, and then figure out, you know, how that's going to transition into a chorus or a drop or something that, you know, might be kind of at a different energy level. So the transition of the automating and all of the atmospheric elements, that kind of helps pull it all together. There's a secondary vocal. If you guys remember from the beginning, not all of these vocals started together. Basically, this is kind of just a random kind of backing vocal that I found, and I took it and I pitched it down a little bit in the audio editing section of Ableton to get it to match where the vocal is sitting, but also instead of, you know, pitching it high, I decided to bring it down a little bit. So this nice atmospheric vocal is sitting on top of that bass and that first kick. Okay. Okay. So that's basically kind of like a transition in this track, to kind of just go from point A to point B. And this drop really just kind of progresses over time. It starts, as that section we were just listening to, it starts pretty minimal. And then every 8 bars, kind of what's on top of the bass and the drums switches. So it goes from this atmospheric vocal layer to a secondary vocal that I created just by cutting out a piece that I liked and pitching it down, which is this guy right here. So that goes for 8 bars.
terrifying embers burn oh so soft and tender.
And and all the vocals cut. Basically, there's this one last fill for this last 2-bar section, and then we're on the next 16 of the drop, and basically all the vocals cut, and it switches over to synths to take over kind of that lead position. And for me, and this is probably how a lot of other artists work and kind of get their sound. Once I make something cool, I try to save that and reuse it as much as possible. In Ableton, a great way to do that is with your user library. So anything that I make, you can even see some of these are labeled as my Shdws presets. These are a bit more of like on the night bass side of the stuff I make. These big kind of FM synth hits. All of these I just store in my user library, and you guys, I can give you a quick little preview into what that folder looks like because I'm extremely proud of it. This is something that I've curated, and you can even see from old projects. They are tagged with different artist names. So lots and lots of presets in here. These are actually all for an old project, and then here's all the Shdws stuff. And there's just hundreds of instruments I've built over the years and kind of curated this list. And to get that like signature sound to kind of flow through your music, even if you are going from heavy night bass house type stuff to more like techie or techno or progressive or whatever it is, if you reuse some of your signature sounds, it kind of makes it all blend together. So
do you often, just to jump in real quick,
of course.
do you so like in something like this that's a little more minimal, when you start looking for other sounds to put in, percentage wise, how much of how often are you going back to your library as opposed to opening a new synth or a new sample pack or whatever? I mean, is that like your go-to then?
Pretty much.
Awesome.
Yeah. There's enough in there between just main categories of sounds like basses or pads or plucks or leads or whatever it might be, to where I know like, okay, I need this type of instrument and I know I have that. And whether or not that's going to be like the final version of what stays there, it's all about just getting that idea out. Like I knew when I wanted this drop to start picking up energy, I wanted a big synth to hit on the first beat of every 2 bars or 4 bars, whatever it was. So I have a library full of a couple of those, and you have that idea, so execute it and make it happen. And there's so much time after that to perfect it and, okay, actually, like, this is a good idea, but I don't like that sound. Let me swap it out or build a new one from scratch or whatever it is. It's just, don't let the creative spark is so delicate, like this was a big thing for me. And I learned a lot of this at Pyramind, talking to people and just getting insight into other people's production process. Is like, I used to never get things done or never really feel super excited about what I was working on because I would find myself just getting derailed. Like I would have an idea and then I would get lost in sound design for an hour, and then I would like completely forget what I was doing before that. Or, you just end up tweaking one sound for too long. And it's when you're in this process where you're writing the song and you're actually putting things together and building it out, you got to just keep that momentum going and build it out as efficiently and quickly as possible. And then you can always go back and it's like, okay, actually I don't like that bass instrument, I don't like that synth, and you can swap it out, but you have all the pieces there and laid out. So
right. And then as you mentioned too, say you're in a brighter mood one day or you're making a more ambient track, you can still pull from those sounds, and if someone hears it, they'll know that's a Shdws track.
For sure.
This is cool. He's making this type of stuff, but I can still tell, right?
Yep. Yeah, it's important because I learned, doing projects before Shdws, I had releases that would come out and there were house releases and then bass music and, it was all over the place. And the problem with that back then when I was doing that was there wasn't a lot of consistency from track to track with being able to listen to it and be like, oh, that sounds like this producer. They all kind of sounded different, and they were also different genres, so it was a little dangerous. So I think that's really important for giving you the freedom to like experiment a little bit and have, people still have it still make sense to the listener that follows you for your sound or what they like. And and it's cool. I mean, when you can listen to a song and you don't see the title name or the artist, and you know, like, oh, that sounds like so and so, like that. I think that's a big goal for making music
Right.
for everyone, or at least it should be, because you know, a lot of people make music, and a lot of people are following a little bit too closely to one sound, or you know, everything feels very like templatized, like you know, it just built off a template or formulaic, and you got to break that, and you got to pull from all the influences, like, okay, I like this from this genre, and okay, this person makes, you know, this is one of my favorite artists, but I like what they do with this one sound, and pull all those things together, and all that coming together will kind of morph into your sound.
Right.
So,
So before, as we go into the next section
Yeah.
here, quick question from someone from Rohit. It looks like, do you recommend mixing while producing, or mixing as kind of a last step?
yeah, this kind of relates to what I was saying before with like getting derailed, right? If I do a lot of mixing as I'm going, but I don't let it get in the way of that flow, you know, and it shouldn't ever be anything too detailed. Like if you're pretty comfortable working and you know the tools, if you have to EQ something really quick, do it.
Right.
If you have to sidechain something really quick, do it. If you're not comfortable with sidechaining or setting up a sidechain compressor, you know, you're not really comfortable with that, and there's a chance that it might kind of bog down the process, wait on it, you know. The more comfortable you get with these things, like I'm able to sidechain something really fast,
Right.
or compress something really
Yeah.
quick, or EQ something really quick. So they don't really, doing that stuff doesn't really get in the way or derail the process. But I think if there's a chance that it will, I would wait on it. But it's tough. I mean, there's a give and take, because I speak, you know, for myself here, but also through the years of teaching my classes, most people can relate to this. You need it to sound somewhat good while
Right.
you're working on it.
Right.
Otherwise, you're just like not going to be super motivated or inspired with what you're doing. You know,
Right.
if you hold off on too much of this stuff and it sounds really unpolished, it's hard to get really into it. So there's a give and take, but just I think the overall best piece of advice I can give for, you know, getting into sound design while you're working, or getting deep into mixing, or getting really deep into automating something while you're working, is just like, overall, don't let it derail
Right.
like that spark or that creative flow when you're writing. You know, you can always do all that stuff later.
For sure. Cool. All right.
Yeah. Sweet. So yeah, I'll just kind of keep going, and this is really how this track came together, is just starting with that breakdown, that vocal, this serum bass, and then just kind of transitioning out of that into this like slow evolution of energy over time, you know, getting away from the really simple kind of vocal section into more percussion and more of like a driving energy with some of these synths that come in. So I was talking about sound design. You guys can see, or sound choice, you guys can see some of these instruments I've used here. This big like FM kind of synth growl hit. That's one of my presets, and I didn't want it to be really dry because it would stick out a little bit from the rest of the track. And the rest of the track has a bit of like an atmospheric feel to it, you know, with the vocals and everything being kind of like dreamy and atmospheric and big. I wanted some of these instruments to match that a little bit. So this has a really big echo on it, which is what's giving it that kind of reflection, you know, that tail to it, which helps just kind of like fit it into the world of the track a little bit. So that hits after the vocal disappears. This pluck right here is a big one I use quite a bit. It's a really, really simple. It's actually just it's a sampler, which is Ableton's kind of baby version of a sampler, which I really like this one. They're both good for different things, but this one is just a sample, a little pluck in Simpler, one of Ableton's samplers. So you can see the sample in here. It's an old school Vengeance sample, and of course you have to tune them when you bring them in. Yeah,
I love that. Haven't heard that in a minute.
Oh man, when I really got like dove into this stuff, I had a friend that just dropped like 40 gigs of Vengeance stuff on a hard drive for me, and like they're old packs, so like 70% of it is like not good, but every now and then you go through and you find some gems. It's just,
but it's kind of like how everybody, like all the kids are dressing like they're in the 90s now. Vengeance samples will be back
Exactly.
in vogue. It's all
Yeah.
good. Just keep flying that flag, man.
Yeah.
Do it to it.
Yeah, a
Yeah.
little bit of a lot of sample packs nowadays are like too clean and
Right.
sound too good.
Oh yeah.
So a little bit of that like dirtiness or
Mhm.
crunch or
For
like
sure.
a little bit of that texture is
For sure.
is not always a bad thing. So yeah, that's just this little like buzzy sawtooth pluck I found, and I dropped it into Simpler so I could play it with MIDI. That's a really good way to basically take a piece of audio that you find from really anywhere, and it can be anything. It could be a piece of a vocal, a piece of percussion, a synth hit, anything like that, and then you can turn that audio into a playable instrument. So that's a very brief rundown of how sampling works, but that's what I've got here. Somewhat simple processing. I guess it kind of looks like a lot, but not all of them are really doing a ton. So just a little bit of EQ compression, and then we're back with that echo again, just to give it a little bit of an atmospheric feel. And these plucks, this is one of the things I use a lot in my music, is these really fast-moving, quick, short plucks. I have a remix I did of a Diplo and side piece track called On My Mind, which I think is, to date, probably the biggest thing that's gotten played out and gotten supported by artists. Shdws played it at EDC this weekend, and
nice.
it was pretty wild. So in that track, this sound very similar to this is like the lead element in the drop. So I try to call back to those things. It's good to recycle things that have worked well in your tracks before. So this really fast moving pluck has a really like menacing kind of dark vibe to it. So it comes in, it goes for 8 bars, it drops an octave to give it a little bit of movement after a while. So yeah, that whole section there, that drop is 32 bars, so about a minute, but a lot of things happen throughout that, and I think that's really important. With house music, the groove or the drums and the bass generally aren't going to change a whole lot. It's kind of what you do on top of that dances around and keeps it interesting. So if you look at the core of the track, the drums, you're always going to have to, especially for in-house music, you're going to have that kind of standard 4-on-the-floor drum pattern. That's not really going to change a whole lot. The bass line here is a very simple, I think it's like a 2-bar, maybe a 4-bar pattern that's just repeating over and over and over. And that's in Silent, a great synth as well. So those elements are really repetitive, but it's all the changes I'm doing with, the first bit of the drop being really atmospheric with the vocal, and then the vocal disappearing, and this kind of night bassy FM synth coming in, and then next 8 bars, those plucks coming in. All that stuff is what keeps that keeps your attention, keeps it exciting. So after that, it goes into the break, which is kind of just another repeat of how this intro started. So there's a little chill section here where it goes back to that atmospheric vocal, and then straight back into the lead vocal and that synth. So I'll play through that, and then that's kind of it. A lot of arrangements. I feel like once you get kind of like a drop idea figured out, and you get like a break or an intro idea figured out, and you find out some way to bridge those together, that's all the pieces you kind of need for the rest of the track. So I always kind of work on the song until I get a section kind of like this, where it's like, I have a bit of a drop, I have kind of an intro or a breakdown section. That's going to be the more like atmospheric kind of breakdown intro part of the track. Figure out a way to link them together, and then throughout the rest of the session, it's kind of just doing that over again, but making subtle changes, so it's it doesn't just sound like you copy pasted it and get a little boring. So I can play a bit of that and then show what I did to make the second drop really have more excitement. Cool. So now we're kind of just back to where it started. main vocal, lead vocals coming back in. We're back to that nice kind of sweeping, kind of analog sounding serum bass, and then it starts to kind of build tension again. And all I did on the second drop was add variation to the first, I think it's just even the first 4 bars. Let's see. First 2 bars. So the drop hits again. It's essentially the same thing. Same drum pattern, same bass line. Everything is coming back in. But I cut the vocals that were hitting on the first drop and a couple of the other elements, and I add a brand new sound that we haven't heard at all before in the song. In those moments, like, even though it's just one new sound and it only plays for 4 bars, it adds a huge switch up to this second drop, and then after that it kind of just goes back to what we were feeling before, or hearing before. So that is this layer here, this peak lead. It's a big kind of classic ravey lead synth, and it has a lot of energy to it. So I will play that section, and you'll be able to see what I'm talking about.
Terrifying embers burn oh so soft and tender.
Sweet. So that was kind of the big switch on the second drop. I liked what I had going before, but I think you got to do something to, like, keep people engaged. Especially nowadays, it's hard to keep people engaged. So it's important, and you start to see that, like we were talking about in the very beginning of this, how you can feed off of people's energy, especially when you're playing live and you see a track. The response from a track as you play it. If things feel a little too predictable, sometimes people get bored. So it's good to have those, like, elements of surprise.
Nice little sweetener later on.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Keep people on their toes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's kind of it. I mean, I don't know how deep we want to get into the mix or master. That stuff is not the most exciting, but it's also not the most complex or deep in this session. What I will say is, a lot of people overthink mixing and mastering. Out of those two, mixing is, like, really what takes a lot more work. Mastering is definitely something that, like, you got to know what you're doing to do a proper master, and it takes, lots of practice and testing and experience to get good at mastering. But all of the work is done in this stage. If you naturally just put together sounds that work well and aren't fighting with each other and are naturally just kind of staying out of each other's way, the mix and master will be a lot easier. So without really tearing through all the devices and stuff I'm using, it's somewhat simple, and it is simple because I don't have multiple basses stacked on top of each other. I don't have a low bass and then a mid low bass and then a mid high bass and a high, like, it's just simple, and simplicity is key. And if you do it right, mixing and mastering should be much, much easier.
So let's talk for a second. So maybe we can get into the mix a little bit.
Yeah,
but
for
I
sure.
do have a couple of questions, I guess. So you want to keep things simple. I think it sounds great. I think all the elements work really well together. But let's kind of dip our toe in the water to get to mixing. Let's talk processing.
Okay.
We can get technical if we want. We don't have to get super technical. But, like, for instance, so the synth that you brought in the second break,
Yep.
to me, when it came in, I don't know about everyone else, but you could hear it really kind of take over the whole stereo field, right?
Wide. Yeah,
it's very
really big.
wide.
Yep.
So that's, I'm guessing, not by mistake. That's by design.
Yep.
So what did you do?
Good question. Yeah. That is a stereo imaging and width, like how you're really kind of positioning everything in the mix, was a huge eye opener for me when I was getting, like, better at mixing and getting more of a professional sound. Even apart from that, we can really tear into that in a second. There's kind of like it's like a three-dimensional space when you're mixing, but there's also, like, 3 main categories that I always broke mixing down into when I was teaching my classes. And the one, it's just kind of most straightforward, it's just volume levels. Something's too loud, something's too quiet. Getting everything nice and balanced. You also want consistency throughout track. You don't want a vocal to come in really loud in one section and really quiet in another section. So on a track by track level, you want the levels to be nice and consistent, and then also just balanced throughout the song. So volume level, and then there's frequency. So like EQing and, you know, what sounds you're picking based on frequency. Low end especially, you shouldn't have a lot going on down there. It should really kind of just be your kick and bass, or a kick and a sub bass if that's what you're using down there. But you want to keep it as clean as possible. When it comes to kind of filling out the rest of the frequency spectrum, that's how you get a full sounding sound or track. So having, you know, your kick and bass in the low end, and then having, you know, a vocal or a lead, you know, in the mid range, kind of as like the core on top of that kick and bass, and then, you know, your hi-hats, your plucks, pads, atmospheric sounds, like all that will kind of be in the top end. But you just want to fill up the frequency spectrum with, I think, kind of as few elements as possible.
Right.
So that's in terms of just like sounding full. And then the third one is imaging, like stereo imaging and width, because you actually have kind of like a three-dimensional space when you're mixing. You know, if something is mono, it's really helpful to look at something like a vector scope when you're talking about this. But when something is mono, it's basically what you're hearing from the left and right. You know, speakers or headphones is the same exact signal. There's no movement from left to right. There's no variation from left to right, so it feels very flat. When something is stereo, there's a difference from what's playing on the left and right speaker, you know, on your headphones, and it gives the effect of it being really wide, or like it's moving, you know, if it's panning from left to right, or if there's delays bouncing from left to right, or reverbs and all these things. And so you have this relationship between mono and stereo, and utilizing that and placing each sound is really, really important, and kind of keeping them out of each other's way and in their own pocket. That's how you get that like clarity. Like you really want each sound to be as like clear and like really kind of sound separate, you know, in the mix, so they're not fighting with each other. That also can kind of go based on frequency. I don't know if it was Donner or Steve. Someone else used to use this, explain it in a great way, almost like it being a tree, where like low frequencies are kind of like your bass and your trunk and your roots, and you want to keep that stuff down the middle. Like your kick and bass essentially should always be mono, right? You don't want those to be really wide, because they'll just eat up the mix and things won't work. Nothing else will really have space. So kick and bass down the middle being mono, and so lots of your low end elements, your mid lows, all that like really powerful low kind of subby stuff should be mono. As you get into your leads or your vocals or your hi-hats and your percussion, that stuff can really be wide and spread and have reverbs and delays and all that fun kind of spacious atmospheric you know, effects or touch to it. So in this example, on that second drop, I mean, my kick and bass are already mono. They're down the middle. So I have a ton of room in the rest of the stereo field or the stereo image to have that lead just like take over. So it's...
And after however many minutes we've been hearing everything in the same stereo field, you not only introduce a new sound, but you've introduced a new sound with a nice width to just make the ears perk up a bit, right?
Yep. It's a good way, just to add some flair to it and some excitement. And you know, some of the other ones, like with these echoes and some of these effects, like that's a somewhat wide sound, and some of these plucks have some of that. You know, and there's a like fun echo that kind of bounces back and forth. But this one is really all that's playing in that section on top of the kick and bass. And again, since the kick and bass are down the middle, mono, right? When I bring in that lead has like the whole space in terms of imaging to just, you know, kind of occupy on its own.
Well, and that's intelligent arrangement choices too. Right? Because you've purposefully added it into a spot where you're like, there's not a lot going on here. I have the space. And I'm sure that was a dream come the mix stage. It was like, I don't have to mix this against anything, right?
Yeah. And you can even see in the percussion group, like I don't start this drop with any hi-hats or even the clap. Like it's just kick, bass, and you know, then after everything else comes in.
Terrifying embers whisper, oh so soft and tender.
So effective.
And then hi-hats, the ride, the pluck, everything else that you've heard before comes back in, and it's kind of like you're calling back to that, but you have this nice balance of something new and exciting.
So this is actually really good. A good segue into someone's question here.
Sweet.
So James Collector asks, and I'll kind of add to this: what's your viewpoint on listening to your mix in mono as a test? What's your viewpoint on it? And depending on your answer, do you start a mix? Do you end a mix like that? Do you never try mono? What are your thoughts on that?
Super important to reference your stuff in mono and mix in mono. I wouldn't say that I only do that, or that I start or kind of work in mono mostly, but definitely when I'm at the stage where I'm starting to think about the mix and I'm starting to question things like this, like the positioning of each sound and where there's space and how things are working, I always on my master channel have a utility first, and I'll just switch the whole thing to mono. Or if I'm working on my setup at home, on my Apollo, I'll just hit the mono button.
Right.
It's good just to set it to mono and kind of forget it's in mono,
right.
And as I was talking about before, with mono being like this kind of one-dimensional version of, the song or the sound, there's a lot less space to make things play nice together. So if you can get the track to sound really good in mono, it is going to sound amazing in stereo. And so it's kind of good just to flip the whole thing to mono, keep working. Any issues that are happening in the mix or the track will be highlighted. It'll really not sound great in mono if things are clashing or fighting with each other. So if you can work out those problems and get it to sound good in mono, it's going to sound great in stereo. So it's something I do very often with every track, but it's more towards the kind of end stages when I'm thinking about mixing and getting into the master for
nice.
Sure. Yeah.
And to echo kind of what he said, if you guys don't mix in mono, try it. And there's a moment, it's one of the little joys in life is when you're mixing for so long in mono, and then all of a sudden you turn it off.
Yeah.
And it really is one of the great joys in life. And hearing the width, and I mean, so long as the mix is at a good point, right?
Yeah.
It's just like, oh, it's amazing. Right?
It is amazing. Yeah. It pretty much always makes me smile because it's hard to get things to sound good in mono. Mm-hmm. So if you can do it and then you flip back to stereo, it's going to sound 1,000 times even crazier than it sounded before. It's also important to mention that a lot of club systems are mono, and a lot of things that you listen to music on are mono. Mm-hmm. So I learned that the hard way. I think a lot of people learn that the hard way because I didn't test my stuff in mono for a long time, and then I would have a show and I'd play a new song that sounded great in stereo, and then I'm playing on a mono system, and like half my instruments are like not even there.
Where did my synth go?
Yeah,
where did my hi-hats go?
Exactly.
I can't find them anywhere.
Because if you're you have a synth or you have an instrument in your track that is really wide, or it's why it's important to have a balance of width, but not have things just be like washed out. Which I think is something that a lot of people do in the beginning, because big reverbs and stuff can kind of just make things sound cool and epic, but they're dangerous. You got to use them with reverb is more of like a mixing tool, I think. It's cool, like it can be a creative thing as well, but it's important because I've with those examples of playing tracks out for the first time, if I had a lead in there or something that was really big and wide and it sounded great in stereo, if I didn't test it and make sure it converted to mono well, you play it live and like you can't even hear that.
Right.
Yeah, right. It disappears.
So then I want to open it up for questions here from all of you guys. As you guys are conjuring up the questions, I would like to ask, because this is something that I noticed. I love doing track breakdowns with people because we always get a glimpse at, what they're using in their projects, so on and so forth. And I know you talked Serum a little bit.
Yep.
I know you talked a couple other things, but from the looks of it, you're using a lot of just stock Ableton plugins.
Oh, yeah.
Can you talk us through maybe some of your favorite plugins or within Ableton, or like the philosophy behind why you chose to do that as opposed to going for a Sound Toys or a Waves or or the hot new plugin on the market or whatever?
Yeah. I think it's a lot more important to know what you're using really, really well, rather than having something that's like fancy and expensive that you might not really like know exactly how it works. Yeah, I mean, I use the standard EQ a lot. This lead is, I think, even just the Ableton preset that I messed with, just because I liked it and it was kind of what I was looking for.
And just real quick too,
Yeah,
this was released. People are playing this, and
Yeah.
it's all mostly Ableton plugins, right?
for sure. I mean, yeah,
Awesome.
a lot of those presets, you know, I have Serum and Silent and
Right.
stuff, but yeah, I mean, this track right here, this is a good example. This is Serum, but what is processing Serum is the Ableton saturator, the Ableton multiband compressor, the glue compressor, the echo, the EQ. I mean, there's a lot of crap on this track, but
right.
it's this pretty much all Ableton stuff besides this one Fab Filter Pro Q and then Serum itself. Yeah, I know these tools really well. A part of that is from teaching the classes here and having to go through. Teaching made me such a better producer because I had to know what literally every single one of these buttons and knobs does.
Right.
And I didn't before because, you know, I knew them well. I knew that I would consider myself, you know, I was really good with Ableton when I started, but there's certain things that you kind of just overlook because it's not really a part of your workflow. But other people are going to want to use them and have questions about them and run into issues. So, yeah, I just learned these tools inside and out, and I can use them and I can make them do what I want them to do. And I think they sound great. And, you know, from time to time I use third-party stuff, but it's definitely more about like knowing the tools that you're using inside and out. Like I haven't found a better multiband compressor than the Ableton multiband compressor. There's really good third-party stuff out there. I know there are great ones, but I know this inside and out, and I know how to get it to sound like do what I want it to do, and it has amazing functions. And yeah, I think that's like one of the most important things.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool. So does anyone here, I know you guys have been really good about asking some questions as you go. Anyone have some questions for Sean, for Shadows? Anybody? Okay, cool. So while we are waiting for people to conjure that up, so one thing that I guess a lot of people get curious about, oh, here we go. They're flooding in. All right, so, all right, so actually, yeah, let's go to these questions first before
Okay.
mine, because mine is kind of to top the whole project off sort of question.
Okay.
So, okay, so any tricks and tips on writing B parts to songs? So probably, you know, secondary parts.
Yeah.
You've got your lead, you've got your main vocal. How do you go about writing? And Vinay, tell me if I'm wrong on this interpretation of your question, but like, how do you write the supplemental parts, the B parts, the counter melodies, so on and so forth?
Yeah. Recycling what I already have in the track. So I don't always necessarily try to bring in new things, because then it can be kind of hard to like mesh it with what's already there, and then it can feel a bit like random and kind of jarring if something completely new happens. But instead, what I'll do is take a sound that has already been playing, and you know, if I want to experiment with it a little bit, I'll just duplicate that track and pitch it down an octave, pitch it up an octave, process it differently, you know, warp it differently, or convert it to audio and start messing with it. But then it's like, you know, if you can create something cool from that, it's coming from what was already playing and something that was already, people are already kind of used to in the track. So yeah, I do a lot of that because my production and my tracks are generally very simple at the core of them, but the fun sounds that keep it really interesting and allow me to make it all cohesive are generally just like kind of different variations of the core elements that are already in there.
Nice.
Yeah.
I love stuff like that. It harkens back to the bygone era of when people were working on like old samplers and they literally could only have 10 seconds worth
Yeah.
of samples in there, right? So make the most out of what you have in the project.
Yep.
And if you're saving a lot of your instrument racks and effect racks and stuff, it's like, I'm sure the creative process can go. You can move pretty smoothly, pretty quickly, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can, I mean, it's pretty crazy how big of a change you can make. How, you know, you can make the track feel like it's going through a huge change by doing something somewhat subtle, you know, like by dropping out your percussion and going straight just back to a kick with the
Right.
bass, or, taking, a piece of the vocal and dropping it down an octave, or, going from having the vocal really dry and up front to dropping it an octave and throwing reverbs and delays. Like, just recycle what you already have there, because the core elements that you have that work will keep working if you just kind of reuse them in different ways.
Right.
Yeah.
So I thought this sort of question would come up as soon as we started introducing third-party plugins in.
Yeah.
Wei Shan, I hope I got your name correct. FabQ versus Ableton EQ.
That Wavy Way, my buddy? I think so.
Could be.
Yeah.
When and why?
Fab Filter EQ.
Yeah. Versus Ableton EQ. When and why?
So I think the benefit to third-party plugins like that is just little bonus features.
Yes, it is. By the way,
that's my buddy.
Waving.
What's up, buddy?
Yep.
The third-party stuff will have like random little bonus features that normal plugins might not have. Like, I think that I actually don't even have the most up-to-date Fab Filter plugins. A lot of my stuff is outdated, and I use what I use. But I think that's like the dynamic EQ, right? So it can change while it's playing. So the Ableton EQ just can't do that, unless you're planning on doing like tons of automation, which would be a nightmare, and it's not even worth it to attempt that. The Fab Filter, in this case, the Fab Filter EQ, that latest one is a dynamic EQ, which means it can actually adjust and change while it's playing, and you don't have to automate it to get it to move. It just does that based on the signal that's coming through it.
Right.
The Ableton EQ just can't do that. So I think that's like cases like that, where there's just features that these plugins have that others don't, is, and you need to use that or make that that needs to happen. That's when you want to use stuff like that. So yeah, that's when I'll jump into
the
third
answer. Just when I feel like it would have also been okay right there. So
Yeah.
that's okay too.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Cool. So, what a near and dear friend of ours and former/current student of ours, Zachary Noel asks,
Sweet.
do you produce predominantly in the box, or are you a lover of external instruments/gear as well?
I love gear as well. I think it can be super inspiring. I think that's like one of the biggest benefits to using gear, is sometimes like just being in Ableton and looking at the same things for too long can sometimes feel a little just repetitive or like not inspiring. And there's nothing like just jumping on a synth and messing around, because you'll eventually just kind of stumble across a sound or an idea, and it'll inspire a whole song, So I think it's really good for that. There is I think also kind of a danger to using too much outboard gear, or, physical gear, is that if you're not super confident in how that gear works or how to get that gear to work with Ableton, the process of getting them all to communicate and, all to play nice together is tricky. So, obviously you got to learn at some point, if you want to make that happen. So you got to practice, but it can overcomplicate things a lot of times. I found that teaching my classes here at Pyramind, sometimes I would have people coming in at a somewhat beginner level, and they wanted to build a studio, so they just went out and bought a bunch of gear. And then it's like, now you're learning Ableton, and you're learning this device, and you're learning how an interface works, and it's just it can be overwhelming,
right,
at times. So it's good, just like it's important to keep a track simple and keep things nice and clean. A lot of times it's good to keep your workflow that way as well. So I think it kind of depends on your experience level, and kind of your workflow and how you like to write music.
Nice.
Yeah.
This is perfect too, because this goes right into this next question. So let's see who was asking it. Rohit was asking it. And we were kind of talking about this before. So how do you manage large projects? So like we were talking before this,
Yeah.
and projects really only get so large when you're working this type of music. But Rohit asks, how do you manage large projects? I usually get lost if the tracks stack up to 80 or 90 channels. Plus the automation.
They shouldn't.
I really get
They
lost
shouldn't.
there.
Yeah.
Rohit, you must be working on like a full orchestra or something, which is awesome, which is great. So if you're working with that many channels,
yeah.
right, or say more than 20, right?
Yeah.
What are some really helpful key things that you teach or that you personally do to keep your wits about you, keep the project organized? What do you like to do?
Yeah. I think there's multiple kind of things to dive into on that question, but to keep it somewhat simple, if I ever get to a point where I'm going up, I mean, I think this song, we looked at it earlier, I think this session is like maybe 40 tracks. Yeah, it's 39 being the last track. That's kind of where I find most of my tracks ending up, is like 40 tracks. If I see that if I notice that, like, man, I'm using so many layers and so many variations, it's getting up to like 50, 60, I'm like, okay, I gotta start cleaning this up and simplifying, because you honestly just don't need that much. And it depends on what you're doing. If you're doing orchestral stuff, you're like scoring something, you need like all these different sound effects and layers, and you have tons of transitions where different things happen. Like it's always different. The case is always different. But for writing music, I mean, you listen most of the most famous songs in the world, like at any given time in like a big chorus, it's like it can be like 6, 7 things playing, and it can even go down to like 2 or 3 things playing, and it feels huge and it feels great. And it's like, so you don't always need tons of layers. And sometimes that can also be a sign that things might be a little over crowded. So that's kind of like, there's a big variable there, because we're all kind of working on different stuff and different styles of music. So it depends. But I use that kind of as an indicator of like, what direction I should be moving in, or if I need to start cleaning things up. If you do have a big session, or you're doing like a big stem mix, or, you just have a lot going on, and it all does need to be there, naming things, keeping things color coded, and just like keeping the session clean is really important. I find with a lot of people I mentor and a lot of students I've worked with and other artists, I go to collab and someone sends me a session and it's just a mess. It is very hard to navigate and get around. So I try to keep things, you can see even in this session, the colors are kind of just for like my main groups of sounds. So all my drums are green, all my synths, and this is kind of a condensed group right here, because sometimes it's better to have like a separate bass group, and then you have your synth group, your top melodies and stuff. But all of that is blue, and then all my vocals are purple, all my effects are gray, and then on the tracks themselves, I try to keep them all labeled. So yeah, I think those are kind of the biggest things. But also, if it ever is getting to be a really, really big session, you should start to also think about if it needs to be that big or not. Yeah.
Wise words.
Yeah.
Okay, so one last cool. Rohit's responding in real time. This is
Sweet.
great. So James Collector asks, and this is a good one, because some of us live in apartments, some of us live in houses, we have neighbors,
Yeah.
yada, yada, yada. Do you use a sub in your home studio? How do you mix for the club?
It's a good question. I've never had a sub.
Ooh,
Yeah.
really? Interesting.
I've never had a sub.
Okay.
I work a lot on headphones, and I have Adam A7X monitors that I love, and they sound amazing. And I reference, I think, again, everyone's kind of different. A lot of people just don't like working on headphones. They need to be in a room. They need to have speakers and like really, kind of feel it that way and listen that way. But for me personally, I work on headphones a lot. But I never just work on one thing and call it there. I'm always, going into my desk and working, like testing it on my monitors, my A7Xs, or grabbing a second pair of headphones and listening on those, or jumping in my car, doing the car tests and listening on my car, or my iPhone earbuds. Like you have to get multiple different like perspectives. Each system you listen on is going to have a slightly different sound to it. And I might think it sounds great on my headphones, but then I go to play it in my car and the doors are just like rattling, and it's like, okay, let me bring that sub down. Like it's good to get different perspectives. So yeah, I've never had a sub. I kind of just bounce between.
You don't have a sub in your studio, but you've got a pretty banging sub in your car.
It's decent.
Okay, all
it's
right.
decent.
So
Sounds good in
All
there.
right.
I do have a sub pack.
All right. Someone
Yeah.
else was talking about their sub pack in the chat.
Yeah, I do have a sub pack. I don't use it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
it's really fun, but it's also really hard to use it accurately as a referencing tool.
Right.
You know, it's got its own intensity level knob on it, so you got to make sure that that's really dialed in. If anyone does have one or uses one, make sure you listen to other music on it and get it dialed in to where everything feels good. And then when you listen to your song, match where that was. It's always about referencing. You know, you gotta have some point of like how it should sound, whether that's having a professional track in that genre that's close to what you're trying to get yours to, or just listening on different speakers, your car, or whatever it is. It's just a lot of testing.
Right.
So that's the biggest thing for me.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. So no sub at home, but he uses references a lot.
Yeah.
Right. So you
And
really rely on the references.
And I know my headphones really well. That's a
Right.
big thing is knowing what you're working on. You know, I've had HD25s, the Sennheisers that a lot of
Perfect
people have,
segue.
and-
Someone just asked, what's your favorite headphones?
So I have Sennheiser HD25s, which you see a lot of artists DJing with and touring with and producing with. They're good. They're cheap. They're like $150, $170, something in that range. I've had them for like 8 years, and they make replacement parts for them. They're just like a good, like reliable, somewhat like flat headphone, which is what you want. You don't want something that's, you know, like a consumer level or based headphone that's like boosting the low end to try to make their headphones sound like, you know, like they're hitting harder than everyone else's. You want something that's giving you a very natural representation of what you're making. So I use the Sennheiser HD25s. I also have a pair of Audio Technicas. I forget exactly what the model is, but those are good. Yeah, there's a lot of good companies out there. Just make sure you're getting something somewhat flat, and then just get used to them. That's probably one of the most important thing. I know artists that produce music on like DJing headphones that technically are not good for production. They just know them really well. So knowing how music should sound on them and then matching that the best you can, you know, it works.
Right.
Yeah.
So then let's, you may not be able to answer this question, but if you know offhand, someone just asked, because this, I suppose, could open a can of worms when it comes to mixing.
Yeah.
What venues in SF have you played where they were mono and which were stereo? Do you know which systems were different?
They're always changing.
Mhm.
I used to play obviously Ruby Sky, and I used to work at this club EPR. Pretty sure EPR was running mono sound. I'm pretty sure Old Audio was running mono sound. Sound Factory was running mono sound. It's hard to tell because they're always kind of swapping out, you know, updating stuff. But now, like, I love playing at Audio. It's one of my favorite places. Midway is great. I'm pretty sure they've all kind of stepped up and they're running stereo sound. Definitely Audio. I mean, I'm pretty sure it's a Function One system. And then Halcyon's great. They're doing like the Dolby Atmos. They got, you know, they're really going above.
big.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's hard to say off the top of my head, but
So does that, and just kind of, I guess, going back to that conversation we were having earlier, does that change? Do you think about that at all when you're mixing, or do you still just go, nope, I want to make sure this sounds good in mono and go from there?
yeah, you shouldn't worry about it. You should just make sure it sounds good both ways.
Nice.
For sure.
Nice.
Yeah, because a lot of like tons of people listen to music on little Bluetooth speakers. Those are mono for the most part.
Awesome.
You know, so it obviously depends. Everything is different, but you should just make sure it sounds good in mono. Make sure it sounds good in stereo. I also know or have heard of a lot of people making different masters for Spotify and all these platforms. I think it's better just to make one that, you know, works for everything.
Right.
You know, and just master it in a way that it hits and it's safe on all platforms or
Nice.
sounds good on all platforms. And yeah.
All right. Well, with that, ladies and gentlemen, again, give a little digital applause out there to Sean Shdws. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
That was great. It's
Yeah,
always
it was
fun
fun.
listening to your music. Love hearing you talk about your music and talk about your process. You're a man after my own heart, keeping things minimal and, you know, focused and
Oh,
so on
yeah.
and so forth. So that's great. If you guys want to, you can always book time with Sean. He is one of the mentors on our mentorship network. He's also the instructor for our Ableton classes through Pyramind Online.
Yep.
And as mentioned earlier, we have a new start date coming up on November 8th. And things kick off with the Ableton Live class in our artist music producer program. Some of you may be familiar with it, others may not. It is a year-long program, And for this one, we're introducing the 6-month-long version of it as well. So you can take either one class at a time for a year or 2 classes at a time for 6 months. What we cover throughout are 4 key courses. So Ableton Live, you get to learn how to use Ableton in depth, use all the tools within it to start making music, producing and arranging. So for those of you who may not have a theory background or who don't understand actually how to write music, that's what that class is all about. Sound design, so you can go with presets if you want, or we want you to have the ability to open a synth, go to a sampler and create your own sounds from scratch, and then mixing and mastering. We talked a lot about mixing and mastering here today, and so yeah, we cover that in depth. So what we're gonna do right now is I'm actually gonna head over to my screen here. So one of the fun things about this event tonight, for those of you who aren't familiar with Pyramind or our learning management system, we enrolled all of you in this cool little course that we made for you guys. So this course is going to be available for the next 2 weeks, up until the start date of the actual artist music producer. We have loaded this with all kinds of really cool stuff. All right, so a nice little welcome to Pyramind. If this is your first time looking for a music school, take a look at that. But what I really want to jump into here is the artist music producer program. This is our flagship program, and if you're curious in learning more about it, we've set this up to really walk you through the entire process. So as mentioned, it consists of 4 different classes. We go through the Pyramind method throughout this. And what is the Pyramind method? The Pyramind method is taking 20 years of experience and putting that into a curriculum, putting that into written material, pre-recorded videos, and highly curated group sessions where you get to spend time with instructors like Sean and Jason and Mario and others. So if you go through here, we sent you instructions on how to get in here. If for some reason you didn't get those and you're curious to see that, just email us at admissions@pyramind.com. We'll walk you through it. Throughout this, we have different case studies of some of our star students who have gone on to do amazing things like Soul Rising, 22 million streams,
Wow.
1.9 million listeners, and he went through our program here, right? So
awesome.
if you enroll and you take these classes and you're working along with them, you're going to come out the other side with finished music, much like Latrell, as he was signed to Anjuna Deep. And we even have some students in here right now who can attest to the fact that, you know, their music is a lot different now after they finished the program than it was in the beginning. So by going through this module, you can see exactly what you're going to jump into, right? There are so many courses out there. There are so many programs out there. And there are a lot of, 30 days, couch to marathon programs out there. And we'll be the sober ones in the room and say, look, it takes a little bit longer than 30 days to hone this craft, right? So you probably think to yourself, okay, cool. Well, what exactly am I going to get? Like I said, you're going to get 4 different modules. You're going to get 37 plus hours of videos. You should leave with at least 3 finished tracks. That's if you're only doing 1 track per class, but our students are always so excited they want to start making more tracks. You'll have 16 mentor-led sessions and listening sessions, 4 one-on-one sessions, and everything that's included in these courses, right? Not only that, but throughout this whole thing, as I mentioned, you are going to experience some really cool group sessions. And what these group sessions are, they're different than, say, a weekly masterclass, right? Some schools, jump online, we'll do a weekly lesson, so on and so forth. These are a little bit different, right? The heavy lifting with the curriculum is in the video recordings, the written material. So we've designed these sessions to be just a little bit different, right? So what do? Week 1, orientation, intention setting. What this is a chance for you and your fellow producers and students and instructors to all meet each other right away. This is different than most online programs, right? Because a lot of it is, well, I'll sign up and I'll just focus on my own stuff at home, But we hear from people every day who want to be around a community, right? They either want to chat or send music back and forth. This is what we do in this program, all right? So week 1, we're getting to know each other's names, goals, what we want to do, our experience level. This is what we do in our physical school here in San Francisco. We get the time to get to know each other so that you can be a part of the Pira fam, right? We want to get to know you as people and not just student X, student 35,
Yep.
so on and so forth.
Those have been awesome for labels in class.
Great.
Yep.
Awesome. So then we get through a few weeks, right? One of the other big things we took into account when creating these group sessions is the frequency of them, right? Do we want to offer more or fewer? Well, there are positives and negatives to both, so we've sprinkled them in throughout. So this gives you plenty of time to be able to actually work on the projects and not feel like, oh my gosh, I have a new session this week and then that week. And then if you don't keep up, you just fall behind, right? So your first listening session is in the 4th week. No matter if you have a loop, a work in progress, a finished track, we get you sharing music right away. And kind of like what we were talking about with the playing your own music out earlier, it's insanely scary to share tracks for the first time.
Oh, yeah.
It's terrifying, but it's okay because you're training, right? This is the place where you want to be making mistakes, where you want to get that feedback, where you want to share the works in progress so that you can grow into an artist music producer from there.
It's important. You got to start sharing your music at some point.
100%.
So this is good time to do it.
So fast forward a few more weeks, you're going through more lessons, you're learning more techniques, and during that time, you can jump into our Discord channel, right? So our instructors carve out time in the Discord to be able to answer your questions. They have office hours. Our staff is in there. We're all music producers and DJs ourselves, and we're always happy to chat with you about things. I mean, if I can carve out an hour of my day just to talk Ableton Live with people, that's a great hour spent. So we get to week 7 and we do the project presentation. Now, what is a project presentation? Well, what it is it's like the listening session, but you actually do what Sean was just doing. You share your project to the class. And I don't know if you guys picked up on this nugget earlier, but he said, it helped me a lot as soon as I started having to teach these things.
Oh, yeah.
That is the key to this session, right? As soon as you have to step up to the plate and teach your fellow students and instructor about your process and what you've done, you start to think of things in a different way. Again, it could be a loop, it could be a work in progress. Hopefully it's a track that you're starting to flesh out by that point, but that's the point of the project presentation, right? So then a few more weeks goes by, you learn more techniques, you have more time to work on your projects. We get to week 11, and this is just one class, mind you. This is just the first class, right? You'll do this 3 other times throughout the program. You'll get to week 11, the one-on-one feedback session. That's where you get personal time with your instructor. And by that point, you should have your finished project pretty well set up. So you get to chat directly with your instructor. They'll give you feedback. We'll use some of his examples from earlier. Well, sounds like your kick is a little loud. Maybe we want to turn that down. Sounds like you have a lot of elements too wide in the mix. Let's maybe bring those in a little bit. Maybe here's another way we could use simpler. Just talking off the top of my head,
Yep.
but that's what those feedback sessions are all about, is really digging into your track, your style, to get you set up, not only for the next week, but then to move on to the rest of the program. And then in the final week, we do another listening session. And the fun thing about these listening sessions in the last week is it's always enjoyable for the students and the instructor to see just how far you've come from week 4. Right? This is where you turn in your track, probably the finished project that you just got the feedback session on, and you just listen to each other's music. You give feedback, you ask questions to each other. These are always so enjoyable because it's not only a really nice send-off to that course, you really just get to look back and be like, wow, so it's only 12 weeks and look what I've done, right? And then you go into the next class, wash, rinse, repeat, and then it just changes on the subject matter, right? So like, let's say you're in sound design, you'll be writing tracks, but we'll also want to see patches that you've made in a synth, right? Open up analog, build something for us. Open up massive, build something for us, so on and so forth. So then as we move on, we invite you to take a look. This is one of our recent students. So some of our earlier case studies, those are students who have been with us, a couple years ago. But this is someone, Spencer, who just took this program with us. I've linked you to his kind of case study here. This goes directly to our blog. It was great. He was so generous in giving us feedback on the whole thing, and we invite you to take a look at it as well. And then we just thought, why not actually show you some of the course samples, right? So we've cherry picked some really, really great lessons and videos and stuff like that from throughout the entire program, not just the Ableton Live course, but producing and arranging, sound design, mixing and mastering. Again, go through that. I'm not going to go through each one of those individually right now. This is why we enrolled you in this little exclusive course. So go through there, take a look. Maybe it's some things that you're already doing, or maybe it's some things that you are hearing in a different way that may inspire you to do something. Maybe it's like a foreign language to you and you've never heard it before. That's totally fine, because we expand on all of that as we go. So then, moving on, as I mentioned, if you want to get started, our next term begins the week of November 8th. Now, this program, it's normally $34.95 altogether. That's for the whole year or 6 months. That's all the mentor sessions. That's all the group sessions. That's working on the music, the access to the Discord, everything like that. Registration just opened today, right? And since you guys signed up on the early bird waitlist and are in here, we're going to give you a couple of things just to show our appreciation and show our thank you for taking some time to hang out with us. So free bonus number one, $500 early bird discount. So this drops the rate from $34.95 to $29.95. I mean, that in itself, like,
It's huge.
close up shop, I'm going home.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and that is good up until the start date. And then after that, it's going right back up. Free bonus number two. We don't do these master classes very often for the online school. And so we thought we'd show some love for Sean here and to the rest of you guys. We thought we would throw an extra 5% discount on top. So if you want to take advantage of that, that one's not going to last very long, only for the next, I think, until tomorrow evening. Email admissions@pyramind.com with the message Shdws 5. So it's in bold here, SHDWS, the number 5, and we'll send you a registration link with that discount applied. Okay, so early bird discount is going to be good up until the 8th, or up until the 7th, I believe, the day before. But this guy, the extra $150 off, that's going to only be available till tomorrow. Then along with the early bird discount, we're going to enroll you in our Indie Artist Business Toolkit, which is it's like a sampler music business course. It's all the fundamental stuff that you need to know, because one thing we get asked a lot after people are done taking just music production classes is, well, I've got finished music. What do I do from here? Right? And
there's a lot to do.
There is a lot to do,
good
right?
To know.
Right. So it's good to learn how to protect your work, how to negotiate contracts, how to license your music, different types of licensing. And this course will bring you through all of that. It's a $400 value that we're going to throw in. And you may have seen this pop up here and there, one part of it, but we're going to give you our whole 4-part mixing and mastering ebook guide. It's worth $200. We're going to give it to you for free if you sign up here tonight, and by the end of the day tomorrow with the Shdws 5 discount. This is really great because this is a really wonderful supplement that you'll want to have for the mixing and mastering course, just some more reference material on top of it. So if you aren't ready to register tonight or by tomorrow, you'll have this link to click here, and you can take care of the early bird discount. If you want to take advantage of the Shdws 5 discount, email us, admissions@pyramind.com, and either myself or my colleague Mario, who's been hanging out in the chat all night, we'll get back to you and we'll walk you through the whole process. Okay. So that pretty much wraps that part of it up. Before we go, though, we've been talking about giveaways, right? And at this moment, I just want to say a big thank you to McDSP, our sponsors, McDSP Plugins. I've linked you to their site. They are wonderful people. They were super excited to get on board with this. We've worked with them a ton in the past, and they have amazing products. So what we want to do tonight is give some of them away. So we have 3 things we're going to give away. For 2 people, you are going to get your pick of a McDSP plugin. And then for one lucky winner, they're going to get the entire Emerald pack of plugins, which is
Amazing.
So to do that, if your name gets called, we'll want you to email us at admissions@pyramind.com and just say that you are the McDSP winner. Okay. And then we will work with you from there. So as mentioned, you needed to be in here and attended to win. So let's spin the wheel here. So this is for the third prize for one lucky participant for the plugin.
Boom, boom, boom.
Chris V. Chris V. Hi.
Is he in there?
Congratulations, Chris V. Well done. Hooray.
Nice.
Cool. So, Chris, just again, this is for a free McDSP plugin. Email admissions@pyramind.com and just subject line McDSP plugin. And then myself or Mario will get back to you. Cool. All right. So, the next winner
Let's go.
for a single plugin.
Nice.
Here we go. Let's see.
It's of their choosing.
This is of their choosing.
Oh,
Yeah.
choose
So
wisely.
choose wisely. Yeah. So if you need a compressor or a limiter, I mean, everyone needs a good limiter, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, Kevin Solis.
Nice.
Solace. Kevin, you there? Kevin. Chat. Oh, hey, whoa.
There
All
he
right. All right. Yes, you're here. I see you, Kevin. Awesome. Congratulations, man. Again, just email admissions@pyramind.com, subject McDSP plugin, and we will get back to you. If not this evening, first thing tomorrow morning, and we will we'll let you know. Yeah, congrats, man. That's great. All right. So, McDSP Emerald Pack. I felt like we dropped the ball, and I should have had you program like a drum roll in your set or in your track.
Yeah, I don't really. I mean,
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. So you guys will all have to just imagine.
just play the build up of my track.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. A vocal buildup or
Yeah.
something to the winner here. And the winner of the McDSP Emerald Pack is Selena. Selena, are you there? I hope we don't have more than one Selena. Selena.
That's a
Going
huge pack.
once. Go to, oh.
Oh,
Yeah,
Nice.
she says hello. Hello, Selena. Well done. Congratulations. I have a hi. Can you give me one more? Can you give me one more chat just to make sure that you are here? Yay? Nay? Good evening. All right, perfect. And polite too. That's wonderful.
Nice.
So that's great. Cool. All right. So there is very nice. So I just wanted to let you guys know too, there is one more prize that we are giving away, and we wanted to give it up through this event because we were sharing some social posts, and our team is just calculating, seeing who was tagging and sharing and all of that stuff. So we will get to the winner either this evening or tomorrow, but that winner will win a one-on-one mentorship with Shdws here.
let's
So
go.
that's right. That's
Nice.
right. So, so for those of you who were tagging and sharing us, we really appreciate this. From here, that essentially wraps up all of the pertinent information that we needed to get to. Again, big thank you to McDSP. Thank you to Sean Shdws.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
I say we give it a couple more minutes. If anyone has any specific questions just about the online program, we'll sit and chat a little bit. We'll give it till 6:45-ish, and then we'll dip out from there. So I guess let's open it up. Anyone, any questions about the online program or the classes? You do have one of the instructors here and myself, the admissions director. So if you have any questions about the classes, get them on in. Going once. I shouldn't go that fast. I should go a little slower on that.
Once,
that one.
twice, it's
Yeah.
gone.
Once, twice. Oh, see ya.
I'm curious to see which plugin the winners choose.
Yeah. Well, hey, winners, when you choose your plugin,
It's a,
we may tap you on the shoulder
that's
to
a big choice.
take a picture of it in a session and then tag us.
Yeah,
So I'm just coming
Oh,
up
yeah.
with this on the fly, but I think that would be a lot of fun.
that's a good
So,
idea. The people
yeah,
want to know.
That's right. They do. And by the people, we mean
Yeah.
Sean.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Of course, Kevin. Yeah, that's great. Do you guys get any kind of discounts? Like, do I or do our students? I'm joking. Of course. Yes. Yeah. So once you're, Jake, this is a great question. So this goes for our ground campus and our online students. Once you're enrolled, you will be eligible for student discounts. Some companies have like a set discount, like Ableton Live has a set discount for students. Other plugins run different specials, different manufacturers do different things, but yes. So if you're looking at a certain product, let us know. We'll write you a student letter. And if any of you are looking to actually start the classes on November 8th, don't go buy Ableton right now. Don't go buy the stuff.
Yep.
Enroll first so we
Yep.
can get you that student letter. And then, so then we'll send you either to if FabFilter has the better discount or if like our partners at Sweetwater or Guitar Center have the better discount, we'll send you to the right place. That's where Mario, the head of the online school, really comes into play. He really helps all of our students with that.
Those are huge. I took advantage of that when I was a student here.
Yes, sir. Yeah, good
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
We do, yes. Discounts at Sweetwater, my man. Yeah, I think we've all kind of collectively taken advantage of that. So,
Oh, yeah.
I have a synth sitting at home that I took advantage of that on. So, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. All right. So any other, well, let's just open it up. Class questions, program questions, or we'll take any other last music production questions for Sean. Anyone else? All right. Cool. Well, I think we will leave it at that then. Again, you guys, thank you so much for coming out. November 8th is the next start date for the Artist Music Producer Program. You'll get to learn from people like Sean. You'll get to hang out with us, talk about music production. And really, when we say this, it's not a joke. It's a big investment in your life and in your craft and in your art. And there really is nothing more satisfying than seeing students who start at one place and the program at another place, making music, releasing music. It's why I fell in love with working in the education side of the industry. I'm sure
That's why I've been doing it, teaching for 7 years.
awesome. Yeah, it's
awesome.
really one of the most rewarding things in the world. So we really hope to see you all come November 8th. Again, you have any questions or you want to just chat with one of us on the phone or a video chat, we're always happy to do that. Admissions@Pyramind.com. And again, if you want to take advantage of that extra discount, the Shadows 5 discount, subject Shadows 5, and we'll send you the exclusive enrollment link. And with that, everyone, I hope you have a wonderful evening no matter where you are in the world. I hope you guys had a great time. Keep your eyes out for more masterclasses like this. Go to Pyramind.com, go to our blog, follow us on Instagram, and if there's anything you ever want to see from us, tutorials, guests, whatever, let us know. Be a part of the community, be a part of the Pura fam, and we look forward to seeing you in class soon. Take care, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.
See you guys.
Bye.